Hi, I'm Doug, and in this video, I'm going to show you how to build a banker station for Monopoly. If your first thought on hearing the word Monopoly is, it's that game that takes forever to play, stick around at the end and I'll give you some tips on how to keep the gameplay a little shorter. I grew up loving the game of Monopoly, and so I was pretty excited when my oldest son learned how to play and loved it as well. The game is also special to us because my mom grew up a couple blocks from the boardwalk and actually lived on Ventnor Ave. The game that we have is a vintage edition of Monopoly that we got for a wedding present. It has a really cool box, but nothing to hold the money and the properties while we're playing. So after playing with the bank being a mess for a number of games, I decided to design and build a banker station that we could use when we play Monopoly. We've been enjoying the walnut and maple one I built originally, and in this video I'll build a second one and show you how I do it. Before I jump right into the build, let me give you an overview of the parts and some guidance on the dimensions. There are 6 money dividers, the base, and the tray bottom that are all made out of 1/4-inch hard maple. The card holder is also made out of maple, and the piece I used was around 1 inch thick and about 2 1/4 inches wide. The frame is made out of 3/4 red oak. This includes the 2 sides and divider, as well as the 2 long pieces that form the front and the back. The dimensions for this project are based off the size of the bills. Ours were roughly 1 3/4 by 3 3/4 inches. Add a little extra space on both dimensions so the final fit isn't too tight. In my case, I added an 1/8 inch to the short side and a 1/4 inch to the long side. Other versions of the game may have different size bills, so it's important you measure the bills from your game. Once you have those dimensions, a little math will yield you the main size of the card and property holder. Alright, let's move out to the shop and get started. After marking the parts, I cut them to rough dimensions, or more manageable pieces in the case of the dividers. This project really doesn't use a lot of wood, and could easily be made with scraps. Even 1/4-inch plywood would work for the base in place of the maple that I use. I cut the dividers to their final width, which was around 7/8 of an inch. I cut all the oak frame pieces to final width as well. Using a stop block, I cut all the maple dividers to length. I adjusted the block and did the same thing for the oak sides and divider. I trimmed the board to the final length and then cut it to width. Again, these dimensions are going to vary based on the size of the money in your game. Recently, I built a larger crosscut sled, but my original crosscut sled was fine, just smaller and more simple. So as part of this build, I converted that old sled to work with a dado stack. I am super excited to have this in my shop now. To cut the notches in the oak sides and divider, I first set the dado stack to match the height of the mating piece, and cut a test cut to see how it fit. I started down the path of measuring and marking the width of the cut when I realized I could use the width of the mating piece to set up a stop block. To do this, I started with my work clamped to one side of the 0 clearance slot in the sled. I put in one of the frame sides, then clamped a stop block on the other side. The stop block was almost too short, but thankfully it worked out fine. The card holder is probably the most complex part of this build. You have to make 3 cuts, each of a different depth, split evenly over the thickness of your board. The piece I used was about 1 inch thick, and so I calculated how far from each side I needed to cut and set up the fence. I cut the first slot about 1/2 inch high, and then I flipped the piece around and ran it through again on the other side. I took 2 more passes to achieve the total height of 1 inch and 5/8 or so on that slot. Finally, I aligned my fence to cut down the middle and set the height to about halfway between the other 2 slots. Now, here comes the fun part. I needed to make the cuts that reveal the stair-step design, so I set the blade to a shallow angle and cut first, starting with what will become the back platform of our holder. Then I slid the fence in and cut and did the same thing one more time. I cut them in this order because I wanted to keep as much of the workpiece supported as possible throughout all the cuts. After all these complicated cuts were made, I trimmed it to length. At this point, I did something I could have done earlier in the process, and I set my blade to 5 degrees and just barely shaved off a bit from the base. This is the edge that will sit up against the front of the frame. Next, I started setting up to cut the dados for the dividers. After setting up and a test cut, it was way too large. Second setup, this one's too small. Third time, thankfully, was a charm, and after setting the proper depth, I cut the dados. I measured carefully at this process, but I only needed 3 setups because I could make 2 cuts flipping the board end for end each time to end up with our 6 dados in the board. With a family and a full-time job, I grab shop time when I can get it. When I came back to work on this project the next evening, my maple base was grinning at me. Not exactly what I wanted to see. I could have changed directions, but instead I just cut some relief cuts in the base so it would bend flat during glue up. I'm not thrilled with this solution, but it's not like someone's going to flip this thing upside down when it's loaded up with properties and money. At this point, everything's still looking quite boxy, so it's time to add some curves. You could certainly achieve this look with just a disc sander, but since I was going for a 1/2 inch radius anyway, I opted for the router. Notice I include a scrap piece at the very end to avoid any chip out. 2 passes on the router got me really close to a final curve. The oak sides I reclamped and took them through in 2 passes as well. On my original build, I cut the rabbet after I assembled the frame. This time, I decided to cut it ahead of time. After marking the start and stop points, I took them over to the router. I transferred the start and stop lines to the top of the sides, and then I just lined them up with the opening on my fence to know where to start and stop the cuts. I chiseled out the rounded corners the router left behind, but you could also just round the corners on the tray bottom instead. Next came the sanding, removing any burn marks and smoothing out the curves. I love to get to this part of the project because the parts start to feel like they're nearing completion. For the card holder, I found putting a thin metal ruler and using a multi-tool sander was a great combination to get power tool sanding without scratching up the visible part of the back. I measured and cut the tray, and finally cut the sides to near final length. I started the glue up by gluing the dividers to the base. Here is where the dados really help out. 1 or 2 of the dividers had a little trouble getting into the dados, but a dead blow mallet convinced them to cooperate. While the base was setting up, I started to glue up the oak frame. I dropped in the bottom temporarily to make sure everything was aligned, then added plenty of clamps. Later, using the muddy base as a guide, I glued in the final oak side, making sure it was very tight to the base. The frame pieces that stick out will be trimmed off later. Gluing the card holder to the base proved to be the most challenging part to clamp. The final part of this glue up was to glue the base to the frame. Back in the shop, I trimmed up the side of the frame and sanded it smooth. One optional detail you can add is to cut a little rounded groove on each side so it's easier to pick up. Again, I used the opening in the fence as a visual guide for where to start and stop my cuts, and carefully angled the frame into the bit. At this point, our card holder assembly is a little too large to fit into our frame, so I took it back over to the table saw with a 5-degree tilt and set the height to around 3/4 of an inch. I started shaving a little bit off the card holder until it fit in the frame. In my case, it took 4 passes to get it right, and you probably don't need to be that careful because if you overshot this cut, it's all hidden anyway. I did a final sanding of the frame to finish rounding over any sharp edges before I glued in the money and card holder. After assembling the card and money holder with the outer frame, I glued 3 little blocks, also cut at a 5-degree angle, to the frame and bottom of the holder. I use wood glue for the main glue up, but for this I used medium thickness CA glue with activator so it would set up quickly and not drip to the top side of the assembly. Working in an unheated shop in the winter limits the type of finishes I can use. In this case, I used 2 coats of shellac. I sanded between coats, but I wish I used something finer than the 320 grit I used, as it left some scratches in the finish. After the finish dried, all that was left was to load up the properties, the money, the houses and hotels, and take it for a spin. In case you were wondering, I lost this game to Cody. Well, that's it for the build. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up and consider sharing it with your friends. If you'd like more updates in between these project videos, you can follow me on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook. Okay, I promised you some tips on shorter Monopoly games, so here goes. Tip 1. Read the rules again. If you're going off your memory from when you learned and played as a kid, you're probably missing out on some rules that will keep the game focused and give it an end in sight. In fact, tip 2 is one of those rules. Not everyone knows this, but when you land on a property in Monopoly, someone has to buy it. Either the person that landed on it can pay full price, or they can put it up for auction, but a property never gets landed on twice unowned. Tip 3 may seem a little mean, but don't show mercy. I mean, the goal of the game is that everyone else goes bankrupt. If you have pity on a person that's about to go bankrupt, you're just going to extend the game. If you haven't played Monopoly in a couple years, I hope you take it out again and give it another go. Thank you so much for watching, and if you're a subscriber, thanks for subscribing. Until next time, I'll see you later.